Right, we shall start. So hello everyone and welcome to CCPS Healthcare Informatics webinar series. My name is Ahmed Bukhari. I'm an assistant professor and program coordinator of healthcare informatics. So today we are very excited to have two esteemed speakers joining us, Dr. Bonnie McKellar and Dr. Christina Schwacker. So Dr. Bonnie is an associate professor at the computer science at St. John's University. She did a PhD from University of Connecticut in the area of intelligence database system. And she has previously been a faculty member at NJIT, New Jersey Institute of Technology, and also held positions in industry. Previously, her research focus since then has been in the areas of semantic web models and in medical informatics, as well as in software engineering education. About Dr. Schweiker is also associate professor in the Division of Computer Science, Mathematics and Science at St. John's University. She has been granted a Claire Booth Luce professorship. Dr. Schweiker completed her PhD from CUNY's in computer science from City University of New York Graduate Center. She been a professor at Fordham University as well as State University of New York before. Dr. Schweiker research interest includes programming languages, data mining, knowledge representation, biomedical, and healthcare informatics. So today, first of all, thank you so much to both of our speakers for sparing the time. So today, both they will share their insight and expertise on methods for semantic representations and analysis of clinical trials, including how to extract structured information using text mining tools and generating these semantic representations of clinical trials. So before we move on, I just want to thanks to our Center of Teaching and Learning, Lisa and Jody, and also our sponsor, Women in Science. Well, thank you all joining us. So over to you, speakers. So please, you can share your screen and whatever order you want to go, you can go.
Okay, so I think that what we're going to do, I'm going to share my screen first. I'm going to start off and then I'm going to talk about the semantic representation and also just give some background information. And then I'm going to go over to Christina, who's going to follow up with conflict analysis and where we're sort of heading with this. Okay, so let me, I don't use WebEx very often, so let me get the share up and hopefully this is going to work correctly. Okay, and it looks like it has. Okay.
Yep.
Good. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to give some overview first because you know, there are certain things that we're looking at. So this is the introduction. Okay, so today's patients, okay, so first of all, this is the context. Today's patients have a greater voice in their treatment options. They often do a lot of their own research before making plans with their physicians. People sometimes refer to the empowered patient. Doctors have become very used to it, and many welcome sharing the decision-making process. This has given rise to many patient-oriented educational and resource sites set up by official organizations such as the National Cancer Institute, hospitals, charitable organizations like the American Diabetes Association, and so forth and so on. Okay, so many patients who are facing recurrent and chronic diseases such as cancer, diabetes, ALS will participate in clinical trials, often multiple clinical trials. And it is very common for them to search for trials on their own, bringing their information to the doctor later. They're often just looking at, you know, what's a possibility for me, or, you know, the person I'm taking care of, you know, what's the space of clinical trials? What are, you know, what do they do before they discuss with their doctors? And again, many doctors really welcome and encourage this type of searching. And this is facilitated, in fact, by the National Cancer Institute and the NIH, who have set up patient-oriented clinical trial searches. Okay, so they fully are on board with people doing this. Okay, for example, the National Cancer Institute has its site for searching for NCI-funded clinical trials, and it has a lot of information in it on just how to read a clinical trial that's oriented towards patients. And you can sort of see my example here. So they even have the language, some doctors may not be aware of clinical trials that could be appropriate for you. So, you know, they're they're encouraging patients to be searching. They have things like, what's the meaning of different phases, and, just how to read these things in general. Another one besides NCI's site, and there are a number of these sites out there, but those are like the big ones. Clinicaltrials.gov is the big one, okay? So it's very well known. It's set up by the National Institutes of Health. All studies with U.S. sites must register with this, and all trials conducted under FDA investigational new drug applications, they all need to register with this. And it's used by a lot of people besides patients, but pretty much, any patient with serious illnesses knows about this site. So it's very commonly used. And you can see they have a lot of research studies in here, not just in the US, but in lots of places. This is their splash screen. When you hit it, this is what you see. So it can be a little bit daunting. And when you go to search, what did I do here? I think I searched on Ewing sarcoma. So you get a bunch of listings that look like this. And, they tell you if it's recruiting, if it's active, all kinds of things like this. And these can also, this is just a slide, so I can't click into it, but you can actually expand this and just get the entire clinical trial record, and everything that's in it. You can search it, you can display it in different ways, and you can download it as XML. Okay, so which is very, very useful. So that's basically the interface. But you can see, it's got a lot of medical terminology on it, and it does require a certain amount of expertise to look at these things. So when you get back to the world of patients, and this is, so when you have patients who are, have very serious diseases, or your caregiver, looking at those clinical trials is still a very, very daunting process. And they often have questions about the trials that even their doctors are not necessarily the best at answering. So things like just the logistics of it, what's the logistics going to be? If I'm traveling with my child, to New York or whatever, how am I going to find lodging? How will treatments get scheduled? How does it impact my life? Maybe my ability to work, so forth and so on. The likely side effects. And whether participation in one trial may preclude them from participating in another trial in the future. Some of these answers may be inferable from the descriptions in a clinical trial record, but patients and caregivers don't know where to look. So again, if you go to any of the online patient support groups, and there's a lot of them, and yes, I know people are very squeamish about the internet, but some of them are extremely important, such as the ACOR lists that were heavily used in the cancer world, particularly, many pediatric cancer forums were set up in ACOR. They were heavily moderated. There were, medical professionals participating, but there was just a lot of discussion of medical treatments. Unfortunately, ACOR has disappeared, and a lot of this is retreated to closed private Facebook groups, which are still very, very focused on these kinds of questions. There's a lot of support that happens here. Okay, so again, there's a lot of discussion. Like my kid participated in this trial. This is what the logistics were like. This is what you can expect. Okay, so that's kind of the background where this is coming from. So now back to the clinical trials. There's a lot of detailed information here, conditions treated, all those dates, the phase, which again, people who are very empowered patients tend to already know, they've learned all of this stuff. The arms and interventions, outcome measures, eligibility criteria, which is where we're focused, and lots and lots and lots of other information. And like I said, you can download this in XML or just go through the site. Okay, so for example, here is one of the components. These are the treatment arms. And you can see the description here. And this is, again, this is taken straight from clinicaltrials.gov. This is what it looks like there. You can also get the list of interventions, okay? So that can actually be useful. So if you are somebody who's looking to see, if I participate in this trial, could that be a problem for later ones? If you're very knowledgeable, you might look at the interventions and say, oh my God, these are going to take a big hit on, my blood counts, for example, and that could be a problem later on. Okay, but most people are not that knowledgeable, or they may not be, at least in the beginning. So the eligibility criteria, that's another very important part of a clinical trial. So that's the part, this is the rules that keep people out of a trial, okay? Or sometimes they're phrased as inclusions, so that these are rules that say you can be in this trial, but a lot of them are exclusionary. Okay, so, and again, from the patient point of view, when you're just looking to see what are possibilities, right? You're going to discuss this with your doctor, but like, just what's the space here that I could go for? They may just say, well, this trial looks like it could be very good, but am I even going to be able to participate in this? So they'll actually walk through the eligibility criteria. Okay, so this is difficult because of the way the eligibility criteria are written. So they're written in free-form text. They use very formal medical terminology. They vary quite a bit in format from trial record to trial record, and this is something that we noticed, like even in the space that we were operating in, you could actually just see that there were different styles of doing eligibility criteria. My understanding is that a lot of people writing trials, writing clinical trial descriptions actually have a template for the eligibility criteria, and they just keep following that template. So you'll see these different kinds of organizations. And so that's a problem, just trying to understand these things, but also the medical terminology and just the sheer number of criteria. A lot of these trials just have huge numbers of eligibility criteria. There has been research actually that's been done as to whether there's so many eligibility criteria that it's actually overly restrictive. And there's researchers who've looked at this to see whether in areas where they have trouble accruing enough participants in a trial, that it may actually be because of overly restrictive eligibility criteria. We were not really looking at that, but that research is out there. John and Morgan were looking, this is fairly recent, they're looking at developing chatbots that are patient-oriented to help patients wade through the eligibility criteria. So people have been looking, and there's a fair amount of research looking at different aspects of eligibility criteria, including research that looks at supporting people writing the eligibility criteria. Okay. So again, I have, we have been focusing on pediatric cancer, and there's a number of reasons for this. One is that it's a particular group of patients that has the characteristic that everybody participates in clinical trials. Okay, so that is the one thing about pediatric cancer, like from the get-go. If you go to a COG hospital, that's the Children's Oncology Group, you will be in a clinical trial. So that's, and then with these kids, once it becomes a recurrent or refractory situation, they will participate in lots of clinical trials. So there's often long chains of clinical trials. So this is one of the reasons why we looked at this particular population. And I also have a fair amount of experience in this world. And I've been very involved with some of the pediatric cancer foundations. So I've seen this firsthand. Okay, so an example of this is that again, there's a lot of chains of clinical trials, and there's the problem that if you participate in one trial, you may not be able to do another one later on. So even this is taken from the Children's Neuroblastoma Cancer Foundation. Neuroblastoma is a pediatric cancer that largely affects very small children and is particularly difficult to treat. So they have the words in here. As noted above, it's important to take the long view when deciding between trials. Some trials may prevent you from being treated with another drug trial down the road, or some may have long periods of recovery with low counts and transfusions. Read the trial documents and consent forms carefully and talk with your doctors about a possible series of treatments that will make the best use of the available treatments while not precluding the possibility of other effective treatments down the road. Okay, so this is, again, sort of the reality of how people are approaching this stuff. Okay, so we took that and decided like, let's, see if we can be a little helpful here. So we wanted to develop a tool, this is like a prototype, that assists patients in some of these questions. And in particular, is there a way to find a path through the trials where, you minimize these possible conflicts? Okay, so the thing is, again, we have these components of the clinical trials. There's the interventions, which lists all the treatments, okay? And then there's also the eligibility criteria, and they often do list prior treatment, as well as a number of other clinical things as well. And so by using the treatments in the interventions and the treatments mentioned in the eligibility criteria, it is actually possible to see if there could be a conflict between two trials if they go in a particular order. Okay, so also if identifying conflicts could also be useful to clinical trial designers. So if you run this tool and you discover that your eligibility criteria are causing many of the existing trials to show potential conflicts, it may possibly mean that your eligibility criteria are overly restrictive, which again has been noted many times as a problem. Okay, so let's see. So getting into the actual system. So this is based on a text mining pipeline, and you would take the clinical trials in the XML format and start feeding it through this thing. And ultimately, what we end up with is an RDF-based database, which is actually stored in a system called StarDog, which is a graph database that uses triple store representations. Okay, so this database, which is sitting on one of the St. John's servers, serves as the foundation for the conflict identification. And also we've been recently, because we have all this stuff sitting there, we've been looking at just different kinds of trend analysis, trends in pediatric cancer treatments versus adult cancer, for example. And, changes in interventions over time and, so forth and so on. Okay, so, so that's sort of the setup. Okay, so more on the pipeline. Okay, so let's see. So as I said, we start with the XML files, okay, and we just loaded a whole bunch of them in. We basically just ran searches for all the pediatric cancer trials, and for the common ones at least, so Ewing's and neuroblastoma and AML and so forth and so on, and took those and then extracted the eligibility criteria. So there's some text pre-processing. So basically we translated from XML to free text for the eligibility criteria. That got pre-processed. It got split into sentences and into bulleted number lists, and there was some labeling that went on. And then that got fed into UEMA, which lets you set up a bunch of annotators in a pipeline. So the first annotator is, of course, MetaMap. So MetaMap basically takes the UMLS, which is the big semantic representation of all things medical. MetaMap is a tool that you can integrate with Java, which will mark terms that are identified in free text with the UMLS concept. Okay, so it does tagging. So that was the first step, is just to tag everything. And then the second step was that we took pattern rules. Okay, so there is part of UMA is a pattern language called RUTA. It's a rule-based language that matches text to patterns, resulting in annotations. The initial set was based on some prior work that was done in the area of breast cancer. We used those and then extended on for pediatric. So that was used to, and I'll explain this a little bit more. So it matches this is just done for the eligibility criteria. So it uses these rules to categorize. Each eligibility criteria is categorized in particular ways. So that's the next thing. And then from there, what happens is that we build the semantic representation in StarDog. And that takes into account the UMLS annotations, a semantic representation of the overall trial, the eligibility criteria, along with all of their classifications and annotations. Okay, so that's the overview of this. Okay, so these are what the pattern rules look like. So this is an example here. So the pattern here is at least, and then there's parentheses, that's going to match actual text. Okay, so it's at least, and then since prior. A number of eligibility criteria match that one. So I have the phrase down here, at least 2 weeks since prior irradiation. So that might be part of a bigger eligibility criteria. Patient must have at least 2 weeks since prior irradiation. So it finds that pattern, and then it would actually put at the 2 weeks and the prior irradiation into the groups. Okay, so that's how they get classified. And then there's also time status. So we have rules for that. So this one here, if you match this, is going to be a prior time status. And we also put in patient's content types, such as is this a treatment, is this a patient status, so forth and so on. Okay, so this particular one came from at least 4 weeks since prior since prior irradiation, at least 2 weeks, I'm sorry. So that one gets classified as past, and then also as treatment. Okay, so let's see. So yeah, so that's basically, all of that becomes part of the representation. Okay. And this is just a diagram. This is the part of the representation, because I said we actually have the representation for the entire clinical trial. This is the part that's not the eligibility criteria, just to give an overview. We start out with the trial itself, which has, the NCD number on it. And it has, all of the standard sort of pieces here, our start and end dates, our sponsors, et cetera, et cetera. List of outcomes. So these all get represented here. And then the interventions. And the interventions you can see right here, those are going to be important. Okay, so we have those. Okay, and as I said before, this gets stored in Stardog, and we can do SPARQL queries. Once we get this thing translated into RDF and stored, we can then just do SPARQL queries for everything. Okay, so this is actual data. I snagged this 2 nights ago from our lovely server here at St. John's. So this is actually in Stardog Studio, which lets you generate graphs. And this shows, again, this is a very high level view. So this is the actual clinical trial. And we have an intervention here. I just wanted to show that this is, we have a couple of interventions stored here, and then eligibility criteria. Okay, so now the eligibility criteria are going to get broken down a lot more. This is just, the top level. Okay, so now this is also taken. So this is actually taken from the schema. So this is not the actual clinical trial, but the schema, because I wanted to be able to show better how these things are structured. Okay, so here is the actual clinical trial, and it has a lot of links going out. I took this graph is huge, so I just focused in on the part that's relevant for this. So that's why you see lots and lots of links going out every which way. So a trial has actually lots of eligibility criteria typically. So we have eligibility criteria, okay. And then, as I mentioned before, we have those matches, okay? So that we have the classifications from the rules, okay? So that is represented as a match, okay? And let's see, and so eligibility criteria are the matches. Now those groups, so the next thing here is groups. So in the pattern rule, I'm just going backwards here. Okay, so these things here that are matching in the parentheses, that's the text. That becomes a group, okay? So the actual text that's matched is a group, okay? So that would be, the objects here would be like the text would be group, okay? And then that text had already been annotated with the UMLS annotations. So that means that all of that text has lots and lots of UMLS matches, okay? And the UMLS matches are going to have the concept identifier, the semantic type, and then the actual matched text, okay? And again, this is set up by group. Okay, so, and of course, those are strings, so that's in my graph here. Okay, and then the other part of this is the interventions, okay? So those are also of use. And the interventions were also annotated with UMLS. So again, concept identifiers, the matching text, and the semantic type. I forgot to mention the semantic type, which is also important. Okay, so, and this is just a text-based view of the same stuff. So you can see the clinical trial. We have a list of clinical trial of criteria. This one had 65 in it. And so then we have matches here. And then we get down to the groups that got matched. And so again, you can see that here are the UMLS annotations. Okay, so so that's basically the representation. Okay, and then finally, this is another one here. So once you have the UMLS annotations, then you can also then use the entire UMLS semantic network and walk up your trees and things like this. So it's very useful to be able to have this. Okay, so and we've been exploring that more recently for trend analysis. Okay, so at this point, I'm actually going to stop my share and let Christina take over. So I'm stopping right now.
Okay. Actually, am I sharing the correct? But let me share the screen 1 second.
Yeah, the share is at the top, I discovered.
Yeah. Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yes, so now you have the picture of how the XML files from clinicaltrial.gov are processed through this pipeline and annotated and stored in the StarDog database, which is a semantic database. And then MetaMap is used to indicate the concept unique identifiers of the concepts that are identified in the text for the interventions and eligibility criteria, as well as conditions and some other text. So one of the benefits of using these concept unique identifiers from UMLS is that, as you know, in medical informatics, you may have different text that means the same thing, right? So this is important for the conflict analysis because we want to be able to pick up things that mean the same thing, though they may be written differently, right? So, for example, for the eligibility criteria, we'll see how we use those concepts to identify conflicts. So bringing, sorry, bringing all of this into the framework of the UMLS is also helpful because of the semantic types, as Bonnie mentioned as well, because later on in the analysis portion, it lets us filter trials, filter our data according to different types of drugs, different types of procedures as well. So this is showing how, both interventions and, of course, the eligibility criteria are mapped to the UMLS concepts. So that's what we're using to detect conflicts, right? As the main matching that we're doing. So as Bonnie mentioned, we have these patterns that are used to identify key text in the eligibility criteria. The eligibility criteria itself is divided into different sections, including inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. So sometimes we have to interpret a rule differently, whether it's placed in the inclusion criteria or in the exclusion criteria. So it has a different meaning depending on where it's located. In addition to that, we annotate the patterns with different properties, such as the time, status, and type of content. So the time status is talking about, is it something that happened in the past? Is it something that's going on now? So the past maybe, may not have prior chemotherapy. Currently, maybe something that's, they're going through a current treatment, or or it could be related to patient status, such as neutrophil counts. So that would be under current, like their current status. Demographic information we are not including in our analysis, although of course that's something that patients would have to consider themselves when looking at the eligibility criteria, because there are of course age guidelines for participating in clinical trials. So of course that's part of it. So if we had, let's say, a complete system and you had patients entering their age and gender and things like that, that could be used to filter out trials that you're eligible for as well. But our focus is the conflicts between treatments that patients may receive and how it may impact their eligibility for participating in future trials. So the eligibility criteria that we consider are indicated down here, which are treatments that you may have received in the past, and the patient status now and in the past. So that could be neutrophil counts, that could be kidney function, that can be all different kinds of assessments, right? Medical diagnosis or tests on the patient's current status. So in terms of the category, we include category of eligibility criteria, we include things listed under absent, meaning it shouldn't be there, inclusion or exclusion. And then these, if something is in the exclusion criteria, we may interpret it differently. So we'll see that in the rules, how if something is listed as, let's say, like someone is being treated with chemotherapy, but doesn't say not, right? We'll have to negate that if it's listed in the exclusion criteria. Okay. So what is the goal for the conflict analysis? Well, let's say we have a patient indicating that they have a specific condition and they're looking at a set of trials for that condition. So the first thing that we want to do is present them with a list of trials in an order in which would minimize the number of conflicts. So that means they would want to start out with a trial that would be less restrictive in terms of which trials they can participate in after that. Okay. So of course we will talk about the algorithm and how that works. So basically, in order to do this, we have to analyze the conflicts between all pairs of trials. So if we have a data set of, let's say, 150 trials, we have to analyze the conflicts between all pairs. So what is a conflict in this context? I think you get the idea, but basically a conflict between one trial and another is if one trial contains a treatment which could involve a specific drug or type of therapy which affects a patient's eligibility for another trial. So we need to indicate that by analyzing the eligibility criteria and checking if any of the concepts mentioned there, such as radiation, chemotherapy, etc., are drugs or treatments of another trial, or a side effect of one of these. Okay, so in some of the trials, it lists not only the interventions but side effects that we may get from those interventions. So the side effect issue is actually another topic that can be expanded on a little bit more. So as you saw, we have many different rules for the eligibility criteria. These are just a subset of them, okay? But these are just example rules that you may see come up in terms of identifying conflicts. So of course, if we see something like no X, right, it could be no chemotherapy, it could be, you know, different types of treatments that are here. Whatever we have in this X group where we would see, okay, what concepts are here, these would be considered excluded. Sometimes we have rules that involve multiple groups. For those, we had to distinguish between which were allowed and which were not. So if we have something like this, no X except for Y, we indicate that you know, X is excluded, but Y is not, right? So we go into this detail for the various patterns. These are the different temporal status for these. Now, as we mentioned, some of these rules are interpreted differently if they're in the exclusion criteria. Okay? So for example, if we have something like history of chemotherapy, if this is listed in the exclusion criteria, or if it's inside of a no rule, right, because these could be nested. So if this is inside of a no rule, or if this is in the exclusion criteria, then X would be considered excluded. Okay. Same thing goes for these, right? Prior X. So if this is listed in the exclusion criteria, we have to consider it as something that's excluded. Okay. So these are sample texts from actual eligibility criteria, and these are the patterns that match. So for example, if these are in the exclusion criteria, we would see that, okay, which ones are excluded. Some of these could actually be in the inclusion as well. So we would have to interpret it differently. So that would be indicated in the annotation. So see, some of these result in a possible conflict. So let's say someone was treated with cisplatin in a previous trial, or in our analysis in the trial 1, let's say cisplatin is listed as one of the possible interventions, then we would say that, okay, since that can affect a patient's neutrophil count, this would be flagged as a potential conflict. So we always say potential conflict, especially if it's related to something like a count or a status that has to be assessed. So some things are definite conflicts, like prior radiation. Some things that are related to an account or an assessment are a conflict, but can be flagged as a potential conflict, but something that a patient would need to check for. So these show the relevant UMLS concepts for the pattern. So you see how even if text may be written in a different way, it would get mapped to the same UMLS concept, such as neutrophil count, normal, hemoglobin, etc. Okay, so what we do behind the scenes in our algorithm is, like we said, we do this pairwise analysis for all of the trials, and we calculate a conflict score. So the conflict score is basically, we go through the intervention list of one trial, so including all of the treatments and drugs that are listed in interventions of one trial, and compare it with the eligibility criteria from another trial. And if there is any match in the concepts, meaning that there is a potential conflict, that increments the score, right? So for however many potential conflicts we have, we considered a higher score. So trial pairs with a lower score is a lower risk, basically. Okay? So the higher the conflict score, the higher the possibility that trial A may affect a patient's eligibility to participate in that subsequent trial. Okay? So what we then do is sort the trials in ascending order by conflict score to suggest a possible path through the trials that would minimize the conflicts going forward. But this is a subgraph of conflicts. So let's say we're focused on this trial. These are other trials that that the patient may have impacted eligibility for. So if they participate in this trial, they may not then be eligible for these trials, or it may affect their eligibility. We had a subset of clinical trials for Wilms tumor, which is another pediatric cancer. And here we see trials that are colored by phase. So you have different trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, etc. And the larger the trial, the more conflicts it has with other trials, or I should say potential conflicts. Okay. So we do see that most of the trials with conflicts are phase 1 and phase 2. Okay. So some of the trials that you see here without a phase indicated, those may be observational trials. But you see, for example, this one is the largest, is phase 1, and then phase 2 are also include most of the conflicts. So you can see that there's a lot of interactions, a lot of conflicts between the trials and the data set. So in terms of how this could be potentially represented to a user, so let's say they chose one trial. So aside from having the list of, let's say that we have the list of trials in ascending order according to conflict, but let's say they chose one of them. So let's say they chose to focus on one particular trial. We would then highlight or indicate, if they participate in this trial, what other trials may be impacted, right? So these first two are okay. This one, it says no prior sirolimus. Right, so this one interferes with the intervention text sirolimus here. Or this one we flag as a warning because it doesn't say no prior. It says at least 3 months since therapy with etoposide, carboplatin, or nicotinamide. So here we see etoposide was part of the intervention list of the original trial. So this is how we can possibly present conflicts to a patient if they're focused on one particular trial. And this is still from the Wilms tumor dataset, looking at the type of intervention. So again, this information is coming from the UMLS. So whether it's a drug intervention, biological intervention, or genetic intervention. So we see the most common type of intervention is drug intervention, followed by biological. So genetic interventions were not involved as much as drug interventions or biological interventions in terms of the conflicts. And then here we looked at specific UMLS concepts and their frequency in the interventions. sorry, in the interventions that led to conflicts. So we see the number one was chemotherapy regimen. Okay? So of course, because this is a cancer, that makes sense. But that was the number one or most frequent concept that's appearing in the conflicts, followed by therapeutic radiology, and then you also have some other treatments related to immunosuppression that you see here as well. So these are the most common concepts that we saw in the conflicts. So as Bonnie mentioned as well, we have this database, and so far we have been looking at the conflict analysis, but we also are using this data set to do different types of analysis, not only for the eligibility criteria and conflicts, but since we have a lot of data and we can connect this to the UMLS, etc., we want to look at different trends that we see for different types of diseases over time in terms of different types of treatments that we see emerging over time. And since we have the demographic information for the trials as part of its representation, we also were looking at the difference between the number of pediatric trials versus the number of adult trials across different cancers. So this is just one example from AML, but we see how the number of trials focused on adults is steadily increasing, but the number of pediatric trials is not, right? So we see that there's a large disparity. So we can use that to show how perhaps there needs to be more funding or support for pediatric cancer research. So another part of our analysis was looking at the different types of drugs that are being administered. So since we have the UMLS concepts, we connect to the UMLS actually semantic database as well, which we can get related information about those concepts. So for drugs, we can access their mechanism of action. So one thing we were looking at for the different cancers that we had in our data set so far, ALL, AML, Hodgkin's, non-Hodgkin's, osteosarcoma, rhabdomyosarcoma, is we looked at the top mechanisms of actions over the period of 30 years, which is our data set. And we can see that there is a difference between them. You can see this one, alkylating activity, nucleic acid synthase inhibitors. So we can use the data set to do different types of trend analysis like this. Another area that we're looking at is applying topic modeling on text of the trials. We can use topic modeling for the eligibility criteria, detailed descriptions. Right now, we were doing a pilot study applying topic modeling on the interventions of the cancers mentioned here, the 6 cancers mentioned here. And while we're able to see some distinct topics, we see a lot of terms that are similar. So I listed the top terms on the bottom to make it more readable. We see the top terms that make these topics distinct. Since these are all cancers, they have a lot of similar intervention types. So what we're looking to do in the future is build a larger data set with different types of diseases we could do COVID clinical trials. We can do different kinds of clinical trials, build up the database, and then we can, do a similar type of topic modeling and see maybe more distinct differences in the types of treatments, and then see how we can use that to predict, what type of disease it's treating. So here it's a little bit more focused on cancer data sets. So that was basically the summary of our pipeline and analysis that we're working on. So in the future, we're working to, build the data set, but also do some more types of text analysis on the data as well. So anyway, thank you. If anyone has any questions, maybe we can take questions.
Yes, thank you so much. So over to the audience. So please, if you have questions, you can open up your mic or you can type and ask questions.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Christine and Bonnie, for your nice presentation. So I have multiple questions. So the first question is, you people are using UMLS, and UMLS is a collection of multiple ontologies. So are you people targeting specific ontology, or you people are using all the ontologies?
I think we're using MetaMap, so it leads us to a concept which could be from any of the ontologies. Correct, Bonnie?
Okay. So
Yes.
if
Although we have been looking recently at specific, so some of the, what do you call it, I'm blanking on the, but basically the various vocabularies that it's drawn from. So particularly looking at like drug information, for example.
Okay, so if you people are using all the ontologies, for example, you are extracting the concept. So if you are giving the chemotherapy, so there can be multiple ICD code for a single concept. So how do you decide that which code is important or which code is correct?
Actually, we're not getting down to the ICD-9.
Not, I'm talking about the concept ID.
Right.
Mapping.
Okay.
No. For example, if you are giving the chemotherapy, you are extracting the concept ID. So you are using multiple ontologies, and there will be surely multiple concept ID. So how do you decide which concept ID is correct?
Well, for UMLS, for each term, right? Because the concept
For each
identifier.
term there can be multiple multiple concept ID.
Well, there's only one concept. There's only one CUI per text. There's different versions of them, but we would take the first one that MetaMap assigns, the most similar.
Right.
Okay.
You can ask them, through the API, you can set that so it will automatically map to with the highest similarity.
So you're right. You're correct. So a text could match many CUIs. We just take the top one. So you're right.
Okay, so you are using which approach, fixed matching approach or partial matching approach of a concept?
I think partial matching, Bonnie.
I'm not. I'm not sure at this point. So I have to go back and look at that one.
Okay. Thank you.
I think it's probably fixed because we take a set text. So
yes.
Yeah, I think it's fixed matching.
So any other question from audience side?
I can jump in, I guess, about the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Does the model take into consideration any temporal effects there? For example, can it address that someone cannot participate in a trial if 3 months ago they did something? And is that encoded in this graph?
So that would be like a warning. That could be flagged as like a warning or potential conflict,
Mhm.
but we wouldn't know. The patient would have to look at it to see. So
Yes.
basically, it would be identified. But if it says, let's say, in the past 3 months, that would be more like a warning.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
included in the model. It considers that the model. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, but it's not something we can know.
Yeah, because it changes over time also. So
That would be,
that it's something that the person looking at this should know that it's a potential conflict, but they are the only ones who know whether 3 months have elapsed or not.
yeah, like something like at least 7 days since this. Well, that would be, like that would be like a warning. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, but yeah, that's why the eligibility criteria are a little bit tricky because it's very verbose. So yeah, but that would be like a warning.
All right. Any further question? Okay, if not, I have a question. So, are you planning to explore the large language model, like the foundations model that we have to like fine tune? Like what I can see, the initial part of your pipeline, like which is the classic NLP pipeline, that I mean, as now we have the large language model available, even so how, if you have a plan, then like at what part you want to take and fine tune?
I think probably for the eligibility criteria that could be fine-tuned.
Yeah.
Yeah, so because that's more free text, so I think that's a great idea, probably
Yeah.
the eligibility criteria, because, or even the detailed descriptions. The detailed descriptions and eligibility criteria, those are the portions of the trial that have more text. So I think it would be useful over there in the future.
So eligibility criteria are sort of a strange thing because when you look at like approaches people have taken to dealing with them, it really splits among people who take rule-based approaches, what we did, versus machine learning approaches, which I know Chinua Wang has done a lot of stuff in that area. Because eligibility criteria are written in this very sort of stilted, it's free text, but it's stilted free text. So rule-based approaches do have some success in that area. But I'm going to just say right now, the large language models, I had looked away and suddenly there's an explosion of interest. So I've not formed like a good plan yet on how we could do this, but I'm certain that there is some definite application there.
Yeah,
Perfect.
definitely in the free text area.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So it's almost 3 o'clock. So first of all, let's thanks our speaker and also the audience. And so please stay tuned on my LinkedIn, and hopefully we'll come up with our next webinar. So dates will be announced soon. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks to you to organizing everything.
Yes, thanks a
Yeah,
lot for this
thank
nice
you.
series.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Bye. See you later.
Bye.